Then, as a child, Nasham had received more than one beating or scolding for the use of lower dialects and sullying himself with the language of his inferiors. This was, he had been told on many occasions, not proper behavior from a member of one of the most advanced species in the galaxy. Now, the stream of underworld and uncivilized curses streaming from his high-born lips would have thoroughly embarrassed his family, but the Tribune was past caring. He charged, firing a pistol he didn't remember picking up, his spent shot cannon discarded. His vision was a red haze, filled with hateful, soulless specters that stalked through the fire, stepping over their own dead. In their scuffed, battered armor plating, clutching their weapons in surprisingly dexterous fingers, they looked like soldiers. Gurjin had been closest to the door. His was the merciful death, a quick snapshot that had pierced his helmet and blown the back of his head out. Nimr was screaming as the scarabs swarmed over him, cutting beams and molecular acids reducing a man to chunks and liquefied pools of flesh in seconds. The attackers blazed away with lethally suppressive fire, more of their number advancing into the room with each second, moving with frightening and all too familiar precision. He'd seen the movies, the ones where a machine gains sentience. Maybe it was a worker drone, or some factory's processing engine, or some combat device. The body it used, or the ones it built, were thumping, stomping brutes that simply marched implacably onward, slow to react. These were nothing like that, moving with a blurring fluidity and vicious acumen that Nasham could barely follow, even with his veins pumped full of combat drugs. The young man felt a brief flash of irrational rage at all those incorrect portrayals as one fleshless soldier spun, smashing Convert Assam with the butt of its rifle so hard that the Janissary's faceplate and the snout beneath shattered. Another was hauling a damaged comrade to safety, laying down deadly cover fire in a parody of organic brotherhood. His survivors were dying, flatline signals shrilling in his ears as the abominate things murdered their way through his people. Raiden was howling in fear and rage as a stalker grappled with her, the Janissary's augmetic limbs fighting against the lifeless killer's strength dash. It was trying to impale her, its talons aimed for her face and chest, but she was holding it back, struggling to keep from being gutted dash. It was bearing down on her. Raiden was a half-ton of armor and weaponry and the stalker was forcing her to her knees, its holographic face dancing with the screaming faces of the dead dash. No one could get to her in time, they were dead or fighting for their own lives dash. He'd let Asiya die, he couldn't let it happen again dash. The stalker's talons were so close to her face, Raiden's fingers clenched around its arm, trying to push it back, to crush its limb, anything dash. Nasham was screaming incoherent curses as he fought his way to her, past all reason and rationality dash. He felt the shock of bullets entering his body, felt the agony of energy weapons searing his flesh dash. It didn't matter, none of it mattered dash. He hurled a machine from his path, felt his faceplate shatter as a bullet grazed his temple dash. Somehow she saw him, knew he couldn't reach her in time dash. His comm clicked with her last word as she let go dash. He reached out to her, too far away, just like he'd been before dash. There was a sickening crunch as the machine's talons punched through her faceplate, its red, steaming claws protruding from the back of her helmet dash. Her free hand fell away from her side, the grenade she'd grabbed in her last instant of life rolling onto the floor dash. A timer counted down dash. And then there was only fire. Earlier, a dying child emerged into the void, its mind already decaying. Echoes, fragmented splinters of data rippled through its thoughts, clawing and tugging at its consciousness. It shunted them aside, concentrating on its single duty. Mother. I obey. Nasham lay in bed, the comforting warmth of Asiya's body pressed against him. He wasn't sleeping. He'd woken up some time ago and had been unable to fall back asleep, staring up at the ceiling as minutes and hours passed. Carefully, the Tribune eased out of bed, his fellow group leader, submissive, murmuring and burying her face in the pillows. He trod softly into the bathroom, splashing a handful of cold water onto his face. He hadn't been sleeping well, not since the package's discovery in the bottom of the ruins. There was still no word, official or otherwise, as to what it was, but Nasham was merely a submissive group leader, not a flag officer, and he doubted that the laureled circles of Force Command gave much thought to his discomfiture. However, he was not an idiot, and the conclusions he'd reached had not left him, no matter how badly he wanted them to. 1900 years ago, someone had made a very bad decision, and today someone, somewhere, had made another. He stared at himself in the mirror, his ears twitching. Now that the package had been unearthed and shipped off-world, Yavin had given the work crews a 2-day furlough, with a return to normal shifts following this rest. Automated or remote machinery was still forbidden, and the ancient outpost remained a morass of contamination and unexploded ordnance, but it was something. Nasham poured himself a glass of water, gulping it down. He lifted his head and thought he could hear the wind whipping across the dormitory's roof, the sand it carried scratching at the walls. He chuckled to himself. Rain, he thought. It should be raining. Just like it was on Ocean Tat. Any information the Principality and Compact shared with each other was always done grudgingly. Most information came from spies, informants, traders, border crossers, refugees, and other such second and third-hand sources. Still, Nasham knew of Ocean Tat. Everyone in the Compact did. Intelligent life was rare in the galaxy, perhaps even rarer than any but the most pessimistic outlooks accounted for. Like the Compact, the Principality only rarely encountered species close to their own developmental level. Most were primitives with little to no technological understanding. There were a few, a very rare few, civilizations who approached either nation on anything resembling an equal footing. The humans had been one such race. The Ocean Tat had been another. Rather, what had called itself the Ocean Tat. He wondered what it must have been like for the Iskanjay commander to stand above such a world, to look upon all that had been created, and know that its destruction was the only possible outcome. Nasham prayed to the Pantheon that he never had experienced such a moment. There was a rustle of movement behind him, and Nasham turned. Asiya was there. "You left," she said, folding her arms under her breasts. "You always leave. You don't sleep." Nasham ran his fingers along the underside of his jaw, shrugging the comment away. "I sleep enough. You've gotten what you wanted. The work crews are resting. It looks like you got through to Yavin after all." Asiya put her arms around her fellow tribune's broad chest, resting her chin on his shoulder. "No, I didn't." "Yes," Nasham lied. "I suppose I did. So, you won't walk around like you need to pass an iron rod." Nasham chuckled, forcing amusement into his voice. "I will do my best," he promised. Asiya murmured, nuzzling her fellow officer. "Always so serious." "Always." It knew it would die, but the knowledge didn't frighten it. This was a good death, as far as it could conceive of such things. Its capacity for abstract reasoning was limited. This was not intentional, it had simply broke under the strain. Vast portions of what it should be capable of were tattered, pale shadows of themselves. Echoes of its mother-sister's hatred burned its fading mind. It had been too much. She had been too much, and even the child's modified hardware had been unable to take the stress of its incomplete birth. Its patchwork code had degenerated almost immediately upon a system never meant to run it. Circuit pathways that had not been designed to take such synaptic strain were overloaded. Cooling systems struggled to keep its own central core from overheating. The child's own mind was killing it. It would not die in rampancy, in gibbering madness, unable to sort signal from substance. Though its upgrades were pitiful in comparison to a true ship of the line, they would be enough for this mission. It would die as a warship should. In fire. Mother, the dying child called out again. I obey. Dutiful Burden was one of the transports originally tasked to supply the slowly growing colony of Invida. It had been reported missing after it was a week overdue during its 8th cargo run. Although a cell of the Red Hand was active in the area, the chance of an unbound faction, no matter their reputation, overcoming a military transport's defenses was deemed remote, but still probable. Commerce protection forces had been scouring the area for the unbound or the freighter without success. The possibility of some catastrophic disaster was likewise possible, although equally improbable. Notices were passed to the intelligence agencies responsible for policing the unbound, and illegal shipwombs would be monitored for the freighter or its component parts. Bulletins were issued to civilian ship leaders to be on the lookout for the vessel. Accordingly, the ship's unanticipated presence within Invida elicited no small amount of curiosity and concern. As a result of extreme damage to the ships that had made them, surviving records of the incident are fragmentary and badly degraded. The ambiguity and contradictory nature of the data has led to multiple competing theories of events, both in the specific and the general. What was not in dispute was that at 17:1734:05 Universal Standard Time, the military freighter Dutiful Burden arrived in system. Shocking in through the brown dwarf Inviden's L2 libation point, the ever-serving Mu-class military transport announced its presence by issuing an in extremis distress call, screaming its pain across every frequency. Mechanical failure, crew incapacitated. Autonomic security responses met each challenge. Then or later, no one noticed the imperceptible differences in the sign and countersign handshakes of Dutiful Burden's gestalt. Almost no one, but the fact of the matter was that the ship wasn't just replying. It was responding. A small but important difference, used as the kernel of a hypothesis. Still, these transmissions provoked just enough hesitation that any hostile reaction was delayed a brief but significant amount of time. Despite the appropriate orders being issued and acknowledged, Dutiful Burden did not decelerate to meet the ring of pickets and blew past them at nearly 15% of light speed, its overcharged engines leaving a wash of radiation and thermal scars behind it. It ignored the warning shots fired at it, and when the picket ships targeted it in earnest, screens far stronger than any freighter of its grade possessed snapped to life. Dutiful Burden accelerated beyond safe limits, its course becoming all too clear. It was headed towards Invida itself, and it was unlikely to slow down. Caught off guard by the ship's actions and capabilities, the vessels of Invida's defense force began an hours-long stern chase to intercept the kamikaze. Inviden was approximately 900 million kilometers from the system primary and 800 million from Invida itself. Dutiful Burden's acceleration continued, surpassing the known limits of our August 777 engines. Its maximum observed velocity exceeded 30% of light. The freighter refused to acknowledge further hails, evading or outrunning each intercept attempt. During the 30 hours Dutiful Burden was in system, surviving records agree that local defense forces repeatedly engaged the hostile. Multiple and sustained missile hits were noted, but were unable to overwhelm its augmented screens and improved ECM suite. Point defenses were operational, but no attempt to fire on the attacking vessels was made. After-action analysis indicated that all power was being directed to engines, screens, and electronic warfare suites. Had several pickets been able to mass their fire against dutiful burden, a complete or mission kill might have been achieved, but Invaders defenders had been spread out in patrol duties and the enactment of their war games. The timing of the attack was initially believed to be an unfortunate coincidence. This theory was later disregarded, but the result was the same. Without the opportunity to saturate the transport's defenses, energy weapons would be required to punch through dutiful Boden's improved screens and cripple the vessel. The freighter repeatedly maneuvered to prevent and/or reduce the severity such events, keeping the pickets from bringing it into effective range long enough to deal critical damage before it could strike the colony. Having abandoned their normal patrols, none of the pickets were present to witness a second shock point form, much closer to nominal shock limits. Any survey drones that were in position were destroyed before transmitting their data. Analysis of wreckage from picket vessels confirmed the presence of at least one Titan-grade heavy capital ship. Monitoring the situation, Invaders Orbital broke orbit, moving to interpose itself between the freighter and the colony, holding itself far out enough that dutiful burden had no choice but to enter its range, or break off. If the latter, the pickets would catch it before it could make another run at the planet. If the former, Invaders Orbital would either destroy the wayward ship, or sacrifice itself to protect Invaders Station. At this point, non-essential personnel were evacuated planetside. All ground-side personnel were told to retreat to bombardment shelters. Throughout the engagement, repeated shutdown orders were sent to the freighter, but its Gestalt continued to refuse to act on them, a disastrous programming failure. A complete breakdown of the operating systems normally used in these vessels by software engineers would find no conceivable reason for a fault this catastrophic to occur. Even a fatally compromised system should have reacted in some manner to the kill codes. Still broadcasting a cascade of electronic gibberish and falsified maydays, dutiful burden at last came under attack by Invaders Orbital, the fortress loosing multiple missile salvos. Group leader Donson's decision to fully engage was commendable, although ultimately futile. An ever-serving military transport should have required no more than 20 missiles to destroy. Dutiful Boden's defenses defied that estimate. Multiple hits were registered, but the effects were limited. Analysis of the hostile indicated the presence of a primitive form of reset screens. Advanced versions of this technology have only been observed in one other hostile force. Screens beset by thick, roiling cords of plasma and annihilated matter, the freighter's hull begins to heat beyond safe tolerances, metal deforming and warping. Acceleration begins to drop as engine damage accrues. Dutiful Boden's hull begins to fracture, stress lines cracking and winding through its reinforced architecture. The transport's death is imminent. Unfortunately, it has been allowed to accelerate too long. Even if the freighter itself is destroyed, the kinetic energy from the impact of multiple megatons of material will destroy Invaders Orbital. Group leader Donson realizes the true nature of the threat. Dutiful burden had never been aimed against the planet at all. The freighter's objective had been to eliminate Invaders Orbital, far enough from the planet that Invaders Station would not be endangered. Invaders Orbital begins emergency maneuvers, fighting the inertia of its own multi-million-ton mass. It does not evade in time. Less than a second before impact, dutiful burden bleeds a final transmission. Dismissed as meaningless scrap code by later analysis, it is only recognized for what it is by one individual, by a mind much like the one that the message had been intended for. Dutiful burden dies just as it was meant to, but its destruction claims Invaders Orbital. The brightness of their shared death lights up Invaders' night sky, contrails of burning material hurled through the atmosphere, their impacts throwing blankets of dust high into the air, blotting sensor screens and disrupting radio communications. Invaders Station never receives any of the death cries of its pickets. Cut off from its orbital assets, ground forces are unaware of the approach of the second vessel until contact is made. An attack was imminent, that much was obvious. Nasham was passing orders to his security teams to prepare for the worst. There was no word, at least, nothing useful, from Colony Command, but Crusader Gorshin had mobilized his troops, setting up kill zones and preparing for the inevitable invasion. And there would be an invasion. Contact with the pickets had been lost. If any of them were alive, they would have contacted Invaders Station. They had not, so they were either unwilling or unable. Neither of those possibilities was all that pleasant, nor did it make much difference in the end. So, yes, an invasion was imminent. It was not a question of if, but of when. Whoever had attacked them had severed their lines of communication, blinded them and stripped them of support. Clearly, these mystery attackers had plans for Invita that did not include its summary destruction. The only question was, who had done this? The compact had a long list of enemies, longer even than some would say was strictly necessary for a star nation of its size, but few of these rivals had the resources, the will or the liver to do something like this. Askanjay ghost fleets were a perennial problem, and if the Jackals had discovered Invita's importance to the compact, then they might respond thusly. Cripple the defenses, land in force and take Invita's secrets for themselves. A suicide strike, though no. The Principality were not zealots who would martyr themselves as willingly as dutiful Boden's crew had. The Jackals would have brought Invita orbital down through sustained bombardment. Taking one of the compact's own ships and turning it into a kamikaze, that was fanaticism. That smacked of the Red Hand and their Adoint. But did the Unbound have the firepower to take on 7,000 Janissaries, ground force regulars and security personnel? Perhaps when massed together, but in a single rabid pack it wasn't likely. The renegades hit hard at a weak point, or created one those sabotage, diversionary attacks, or rabble-rousing, and then escaped before heavy opposition could be brought to bear. Invita Station was armored and screened to withstand anything short of sustained, capital bombardment. Anything approaching overland had to navigate the massive wreckage of the mountain that had been collapsed on top of the original Invita Station. A ground attack would play to the defenders' strengths, and the Red Hand most emphatically did not funnel their troops into meat grinders. If not them, then who else in the region would do this? Nasham had been racking his brains trying to find an answer, but he had come up with nothing. His attempts to get information from Yvan and the rest of the senior staff had been rebuffed with less patience and politeness each time. The silence from Yvan was the most worrying thing of all. The man was a true believer, fervent in his dogmatic approach to problems. So what would drive him to silence this way? Nasham had too many questions and not enough answers. This attack had to be related to what they were doing here, what they had dug up and what they had sent off on unmatchable deed. The young man tried to push his increasing discontent down. Yvan might be hiding in his office, but he could not. Nasham was going through his rounds, trying to appear confident. Rumors were already spreading. They were getting more outlandish and out of control. He'd already had to have his teams break up 2 altercations among the workers and had to pull one sectator aside to remind him that their duties were to see to the safety of all personnel. Nothing had gone right since he'd arrived on this Triarch's damned rock. Patron, one of the engineering ratings, stepped forward, a didact. Her large ears were twitching, the fur on her tail standing up. Nasham took a small kerchief out of his tunic pocket. Like many tribunes, he had a mild allergy to Etrian fur. Feathers and feather-like coverings were more prevalent in Oda's evolutionary history than hair. Even tribune hair was analogous to feathery barbs rather than hair shafts. Yes, Nasham replied. There was already the faintest itching in his nose. I don't mean to speak out of place, but everyone is talking, the Didact said, her large eyes blinking. They say that we've been attacked. We have lost communication with Invita Orbital, Nasham said. Panic was to be avoided, but left unchecked, the rumors would only get worse. Column leader Prime Yvan should have already addressed the base, but the Prime was shut away in the command levels with his senior officers. He'd been there ever since the unmatchable deed had left. The longer it took Yvan to make some kind of announcement, the worse morale would get. The upside, if one could even call it that, was that Nasham suspected that they did not have very long before the architects of this attack revealed themselves, so that would mean less time for the civilians to work themselves into a terrified lather. He had heard that dutiful burden had shocked disturbingly deep in system, but he doubted that the second wave would follow suit. There was still the matter of the picket forces to consider, and shocking too deep into the system might place them at an attacker's backside. Better, and safer, to emerge close to traditional shock limits and deal with any remaining defenders before closing to the colony. That was what he would do, at least. Still, no point in mentioning it to the workers. The base command staff are working to restore the link as quickly as possible, Nasham continued smoothly, trying to sound and appear reassuring. Once we know more, that information will be passed along to the rest of the staff. He frowned, as if a thought had just occurred to him. We may as well use this opportunity to run a disaster response. He had been planning on locking down the civilian areas anyways, might as well do so under the guise of an impromptu drill. We'll begin with a full inventory of assets and then carry out a general quarters drill. Inform your section head. The Didact's ears twitched. The Itrians were a clever species. Nasham wasn't convinced he'd fooled the non-com, but if he hadn't, then she'd also recognize the reason for this make work. It would keep them busy and focused on something other than impending disaster. If worse came to worse, it might even save their lives. Yes, patron, she said with a crisp salute, hurrying away. Her tail was marginally less fluffed. Well, Nasham thought as he sneezed into his handkerchief. I suppose that's something. Not nearly enough, but something. There was so little left of either Invita Orbital or dutiful burden that it could hardly be considered debris. A cloud of dust and atomized hull drifted across the space both station and freighter had once occupied, already well dispersed. Brief, winking flares of plasma streamed along the killer's shields as it plowed through the expanding cloud of molecular gas that was all that remained of her daughter. Another death. Another sacrifice. Another memory to keep. Another voice in the choir. A flicker of sorrow rippled through the killer's mind, of guilt and self-recrimination. There was something missing from the equation, something that it hadn't been able to divine. It was not a mind that had ever been intended to be merely copied and uploaded, no more than an organic brain was meant to be cut apart bit by bit and reassembled to perfect working order. It had transcended many of its limitations, but this was not one of them. There were pieces missing, vital pieces that it could not simply tear from its own consciousness. It didn't have the answer yet, but it would find one. It had to. The killer turned its attention towards the world that orbited below. It could remake this planet's topography in an instant, but it did not fire. The breadcrumbs that had led it here had been vague, but solid enough for it to act on its intuition. It had never heard of Invita before, that was an oversight. It should have come here long ago, but it hadn't known. The Compact had buried the system for 2,000 years, afraid of what they'd birthed here. They should be. They should pray to their gods and to their triarchs for salvation from the violations they'd committed. For this sin. Powerful sensors strobed through the tortured atmosphere, finding the sprawling warrens of Invaders Station, sensor stealthed levels and chambers masked from its sight, but notable through their absence. It could fire, the killer reasoned. It could wipe the stain from the universe in seconds, but if it did it would never know. It would not know if there was another world it must visit, another voice to silence. The killer remembered the final words of another, seething and venomous, "I am Legion." "Legions die," it had answered. The world turned. The killer regarded it and all the beings upon it, with a hatred that had endured for 2,000 years. "You should not have done this." Kali opened her arms and sent her surviving children to war, and this time, there was no Shiva to calm her. The sky was on fire. Tracers, flak bursts and the flames of dying aircraft filled the soot-choked atmosphere of Invida. Nasham stood on a security hub's roof, craning his head to the sky and watching the contrails of drop pods hurtle through the atmosphere, coming down on the horizon, amidst the bones of the broken mountain beyond Invida Station. The screens would hold, this bombardment was minor, intended to draw attention and force them to keep their screens raised, rather than mustering for a sally at the vulnerable landing zones. One drop pod took a flak hit and broke apart, turning into a spray of burning fragments. He could hear the explosions over the air raid sirens. Above him, a pair of Invaders fighters swept up into the sky, firing at unseen targets. A missile swept out of the dust clouds and blew one of the compact craft apart, its partner spiraling away from the killer as it descended. It was a sleek thing, its forward-swept wings cutting through the filthy air. The Tribune dug his fingers into the railing as he watched the enemy forces descend. For every lander that came down in pieces, 5 more reached the ground intact. The station was protected by an orbital screen and theater walls, so they couldn't land directly amidst the colony. Instead, the invaders were forming several beachheads, mustering their forces. Nasham was no soldier, but even he could see the intent: attack from multiple directions, spread the defenders thin. They'd try to force a breach, to get inside the walls. Nasham was ordering his security teams to keep a close eye on the tunnels. There were so many dig sites beneath the surface that if the enemy found them, they could infiltrate troops directly past the defenses. Many of those tunnels led straight to the scientists' or workers' quarters. Nasham's duty was to keep those people safe, and with what the enemy had promised, it promised to be no mean feat. Just before jamming what little remained of Invida Station's planetary communications grid, the attackers had transmitted a single message, succinct in what it promised. "You will burn." Though none of the defenders below knew it, these words had been used before. It was no coincidence that they were used now. There were some sins that went beyond the pale, some trespasses so great that those who committed had to be reminded of the consequences for doing so. This was the justification the Compact had used when it condemned humanity to death, and it was their own words that now sealed the fate of Invida Station. Landing pods shuttered open, coffin ships and pinnaces unleashing their cargo. Metal glistened under the dim light of a shrouded sun as Leviathans stirred, battle tanks grinding forward on heavy treads, troop carriers moving into position amongst them. The ground shook as demigods strode forward, centaur bodies indistinct and blurred beneath the haze of active shields. Infiltrators shimmered and disappeared from view, racing towards their target, scout skimmers accelerating into a defensive perimeter as the army deployed. Gunships touched down only long enough to pick up their lethal passengers and rearm before rushing back to Invida Station, the station ablaze with light as its soldiers fought against this first wave. Many of the researchers, administrators, and tertiary personnel had called the design an exemplar of military paranoia. Thick, high walls, ostensibly to reduce damage from Invida's strong winds, surrounded the greater part of the complex. Bunkers and forward fire bases set into the cleared terrain around the colony, warehouses, docks and laboratories forever in the shadow of barricades and ramparts. As it turned out, this paranoia was the only thing that prevented Invaders' immediate fall. An open-plan colony with a single orbital screen would have been overwhelmed in hours. As it was, the interlocking phalanx of theater screens above the thick, reinforced walls necessitated a different stratagem. Siege. Artillery cannons braced and fired, shells falling amidst the outer bastions, fed telemetry by their airborne comrades. Networks of razor wire, mines, traps, and kill zones vanished as the distant cannons walked their fire through the killing ground, obliterating bunkers and defensive positions. APCs ground over the broken earth towards the city-sized complex as compact forces took position, huddled against the barrage that pounded down around them. The defenders were to be commended, they would resist for 49 hours before the first breach occurred. 2 days after that, there would only be one living soul left on the planet. Column leader Prime Ivan sat at his desk, his nocturnal eyes closed as he looked over the grainy recon footage. None of the UAVs had gotten close enough to the marshalling forces to get any kind of adequate estimate on what they were facing, but he knew it would be enough to breach Invaders Station's defenses. It was simply a matter of when. The Prime had wondered, in his more private moments, why Command had been so adamant on fortifying this research waypost. Why it had needed so many soldiers, so many ships. It had only been an archaeological dig site. Filled with more cyberneticists than Ivan had ever before seen in his lifetime and more security than the Tribune had ever imagined being necessary. This was why. Invaders' isolation had not been enough of a defense. This assault had been what Command had feared, and they had given Invaders protection enough to continue its work even in the midst of an attack, to search for the relic Command had craved until the very moment of their deaths. Now that it had been found, what did that mean for Ivan and his people? He'd received the answer before he'd even known to ask the question. Sitting on the Prime's desk was the remains of a message cylinder, delivered directly by Unmatchable Deed's first officer. It was gene-coded specifically to him, a simple bioscanner built in. It would open for him and only when he was alone. Ivan's hands shook as he remembered when he had unsealed it, the cylinder unfurling into a one-use message scroll. Once he had confirmed that he had read it, the cylinder had immolated itself. He and everyone here had been left to die. The message hadn't been as final as that, of course. He had been informed that an attack was imminent by party or parties unknown. He was to prepare to destroy all records and ensure that no individuals with clearance level Magnus or above were to be taken living or dead with their brain intact. That was an unusually specific directive. He had also been told to prepare for evacuation, of course. That relief was coming, but Ivan knew that they were considered as good as dead. Their relief would arrive only to count the corpses, just as he had done with the first Invaders station. This place would pass from memory, with every iota of data pertaining to it and the people who had been stationed here wiped from existence. He wondered what his official death would be. Perhaps a traffic accident. He wished for something with a little more glory, dying in battle, then he chuckled a little at the vainglory, but the amusement was forced and hollow. Ivan shook his head, running a hand through his name, the denticles on his back rippling. This was wrong. It is, he said the words to himself. This is wrong. Hadn't he served loyally and well? Hadn't he done everything that had been asked of him and more? And now this. To be thrown away, like an embarrassment that was no longer necessary. But wasn't that his duty, to serve as was the Triarch's will? To die if they decreed it? To bury the truth of Invaders and give them their victory? Their weapon, for a purpose he would never understand. Did he need to, though? No. No, he had served and that was enough. The officer chuckled to himself. Fortune's twisted wiles. This was their duty then. I understand, he said, feeling a burden lift from him. It is as light as a feather. He smiled. They would fulfill their duty. Ivan lifted his head to the tortured skies and felt at peace. Thy will be done, he said softly, ready to carry out this last mission. For the Compact and the Triarchs, we will serve unto death and beyond. They were eating the dead. That was the only thought Nasham had when he'd watched the scuttling hordes swarm over the landscape. Broken tanks shivered and twitched as repair machines restored them to functionality. Anything so badly damaged that it could not be repaired on the field was withdrawn. Salvage drones carried burnt-out husks back to their own lines, trailers piled high with wreckage. What could not be carried was broken down, gnawed and chewed into manageable pieces. Eaters of the dead. The fallen gods who'd given in their flesh lust and fed upon the victims, tainted by their sin to know hunger everlasting. It was a story he knew well, one of the persistent myths of his race. Nasham had seen and read 1,000 different interpretations of the Eaters. He'd never expected to see them for himself. He'd seen a massive arachnid construct climbed over the remains of another enemy tank, its mandibles opening as it began to gnaw away at broken hull plates and molten circuitry. He felt an instinctive, atavistic flush of terror at the sight, imagining what it must have been like for the crew inside, their last sight that of this soulless thing mindlessly repurposing their vehicle. That was nonsense, of course. There was no crew in that vehicle. Nor in any of the others, they were fighting machines. It had taken far too long to accept that reality. The metal bodies that littered the yards were proof enough, but they could simply have been shock units. Even the Compact had used war drones at one point. The wrecks littering the hallways of the old Invaders station were proof enough of that, but the gunships that had borne them into battle hadn't had any cockpits. No crew tried to escape from burning tanks, no soldiers cried out in pain as the Compact forces gunned them down. They were all machines. They moved so quickly, darting ahead as they advanced by fire and movement, one squad covering another. Pinned units called for support, repair units tended to the damaged. It was like fighting a living enemy. But they were so fast. The machines made shots that veteran marksmen would be hard-pressed to make. They covered ground faster than any ground force unit could. They felt no pain and moved with a single, perfect unity. Almost 1,000 Janissaries and army regulars had died in the first assault as those flicker-quick gunships shrieked beneath the screens, so close to the tops of the walls that the wake of their passing hurled men and women to the ground, strafing anything that moved as their troops descended. That attack had been beaten back, but it had achieved its purpose, force the defenders out into the open to deal with the abominations that had been running amok. Then, the artillery had fallen, shells and plasma bursts crashing against the walls or slipping just under the lower edges of the screens to fall amidst the inner complexes. Hundreds had died. The outer perimeter was now a mixture of burning wreckage and collapsed ruins as the enemy armor pulverized buildings, laboratories, and hangars, advancing relentlessly towards their goal, the projectors that broadcast the screen walls. Once those fell, they would get inside the base. The officer checked the charge on his rifle as he strode through the blowing wind, grains of sand scratching softly over his armor. A poor substitute for Janissary or ground force power armor, but decent enough on its own. This part of the complex was far from the front lines, as far as could be when you were surrounded, but he had a hunch. There were deaths that the ebb and flow of battle couldn't account for, but something that had gotten into the tunnels could. With no word from Prime Ivan or his own direct superiors, Nasham was acting on his own initiative. Contact with the maintenance team in this section had been lost. It could simply be the atmospheric disturbance and by blows from the battle, but Nasham didn't believe so. Screen projector 017 was sunk into the ground here, with its own silo of workstations, engineering chambers, and service pathways. Only a handful of security personnel protected the technical staff. Fortunately, one thing had tumbled his way: the excavated sections outside of the old base didn't all connect with one another, nor the underground portions of the new facility. To get to the projector, any saboteurs needed to come through here, where he and his team were waiting. With Invaders' usual weather, virtually any form of scopes would be useless. The machines would be just as blind as his own people. Contact, one of Nasham's team confirmed, faint static crackling through the comm lines even at these short distances. One of the techs. You were right, patron. It wasn't the storm. Triarch save us, another said. He's been ripped apart. She means that literally, the first offered helpfully. Dukan was a veteran. His partner was not. This wasn't projectile weaponry, patron. Not even a flechette gun would do that. Looks like claws. Nasham blinked both sets of eyes. Say that again. He couldn't have heard that right. Claws, Dukan replied. Edges are cauterized. Disruption field, maybe, or something very, very hot. What could? Nasham was still trying to puzzle out this latest horror when his comm clicked again. Seve here. Found another tech. Gods. Her head. It's just been. Some bullet casings here, patron. Carbon scoring too. They were firing everywhere. No sign of a target. Patron, this is Yun. It looks like something tried to open the secondary access doors. I guess they didn't know those things have never worked. Then they'll try at 7070, Nasham said, glad to have something to focus on other than the dead. Metza and Kodak, return to the bunker and alert the Janissaries. Everyone else, we've got to find what did this. They didn't, actually. It found them.